Rebecca is Senior Lecturer in Literary Studies in the School of Media and Communication at the RMIT University in Melbourne, where she's a member of the Communication, Politics, and Culture Research Group. Is that the right title? Yeah. Her research interests center on feminist theory and contemporary continental thought. Her first book, The Interval, Relation and Becoming in Irigaray, Aristotle and Bergson, was published by Fordham in 2012. And she's currently writing a book about time and difference in Deleuze, Aristotle and Bergson. And the title of her talk today is Always Other and Coexistent, Figures of Time in Aristotle, Irigaray and Bergson.
Okay, I'd like to situate this paper in the context of my current research, which is on the conceptualization of difference. At the moment, I'm trying to think difference in terms of the relationship between two different figurations of time, the time of coexistence and mobile time. Note that I said figurations of time. Whatever time is, the figuration of time, for instance, as coexistence or as mobile time, cannot do justice to what is essentially in excess of figuration. One of the contexts of my effort to think about the distinction between coexistent time and mobile time is explicitly feminist. As Irigaray argues in An Ethics of Sexual Difference, and I quote, "In order for sexual difference to take place, we must reconsider the whole problematic of space and time." I'm particularly interested in thinking about the status of the maternal in terms of time, and I find Irigaray's early work on the maternal the most suggestive in her corpus for this project. In How to Conceive of a Girl, from Speculum of the Other Woman, she suggests that the maternal is the effaced ground on which Aristotle's unmoved mover is erected. The source of movement and order in the cosmos, the unmoved mover, is of course figured as masculine, indeed as a beautiful boy, as Emma Bianchi argues in her brilliant queer reading of Aristotle's cosmology in her new book. For Irigaray, the maleness of the unmoved mover is a phallomorphic projection on the cosmic scale. Obliquely, she suggests that the unmoved mover is, she calls it the supreme self-principle, and that this self-principle conceals man's debt to the mother. But it's not only as the repressed ground of the pure actuality of the unmoved mover that Irigaray figures the maternal. There is a sense in which the maternal is all of time-space from which we never separate. This is a concept of the maternal as absolutely impersonal, as immanence. We cannot even speak strictly here of the we or of the I when we're dealing with this idea of the immanent maternal. The hints of the idea of the maternal as immanent appear in another essay of Irigaray's From Speculum, which is translated in the English translation as volume fluidity, but I would prefer to call it the uncircumscribable volume. I'm going to return to this essay at the end of the paper. Mostly, though, what I'm about to talk about is focused on Aristotle and a little towards the end on Bergson. The dominant concept of time in Aristotle figures time as the measurement of motion. Nonetheless, in excess of this construal, I think that there are hints of a thinking of time in Aristotle that cannot be understood in terms of motion or constrained to any kind of figure. And this appears in bits and pieces, in traces, in the last few chapters of Book 4 of the Physics. These hints of an other thinking of time offer a glimpse of immanent time. This is not developed systematically in Aristotle's thought, and it sits in tension with the dominant conception of chronos, which is as the measure of motion. So I'll talk a bit about the relationship between chronos and motion, or kinesis, for Aristotle in Physics 4. Aristotle notes that chronos is often thought to be motion because motion and chronos are apprehended together, He says, mostly he talks about motion as kinesis, but he also uses metabolus, and he says in this book that he doesn't need to distinguish between metabolus and kinesis, but I'll mostly say kinesis. So while chronos is apprehended with kinesis, chronos and kinesis cannot be identical. There are many motions in the cosmos, and each motion is specific to that thing which is changing, while chronos is equally everywhere and with everything. Further, he claims that it is through chronos that we measure motion. For instance, a fast change or a slow change is defined by time, by chronos. Aristotle elaborates on the implication of chronos and kinesis with a formulation of the now, or nun, as what is in between the before and the after. In a proto-phenomenological passage, he points out that our awareness of movement involves a marking off of the before and the after in motion. As we mark off the before and the after of a motion, we also mark off the before and the after in time. Aristotle says that if we're not aware of motion, we are not aware of time. And yet, we also know the passage of the before and the after of time in the dark, when we are unaffected by any bodily movement whatsoever. He does not develop the implications of his description of the awareness of the passing from the before to the after in the psyche, occurring without an experience of embodied motion. And this is one instance in Physics 4 in which time escapes from its subordination to motion, from its subordination as the measurement of motion. I want to say a little more about how Aristotle deploys the before and the after, to proteron kai husteron, in relation to the now. For Aristotle, this is a quotation, we say that time has passed when we get a perception of the before and the after in kinesis. We mark off kinesis by taking the before and the after to be different things, and some other thing in between them. For whenever we conceive of the limits as other than the middle, and the soul says that the nows are two, one before and one after, this it is that we say time is. The movement from the now which is before to the now which is after is a movement from one limit to another limit. Aristotle also says that there is something in between the now limit, which is before, and the now limit, which is after. That something which resides in between the two limits is what Henri Bergson draws on to posit the very becoming and mobility of duration's progress as continuous and heterogeneous change. But Aristotle's focus is on the difference noticed by the soul between the now that comes before and the now that comes after. He declares that time is the counting of a sequence of nows by which we measure kinesis. Chronos is defined as, and I quote, a number of kinesis in respect of before and after. On this definition, time is that aspect of motion that can be counted. For Aristotle, time is not number in the sense of being that by which we count. Time is what is counted. To use an analogy, as he's wont to do, we can count 100 horses or we can count 100 men. And while we get the same number, the beings that are counted, the horses and the men, are not numbers. Here, time is analogous to the horses or to the men, rather than to numbers, which are added up to produce a sum. The definition of chronos as a number of kinesis in respect of before and after is frustrating. Whether the before and the after is figured as the different nows, or as the different limits, or as different numbers, the very whatever it isness that is in between, what Bergson would call the very interval of time, remains elusive. In Wiesier and Gramm, Derrida, following Heidegger, argues that the Aristotelian conceptualization of time is constrained by trying to think time in terms of its being, and that being is, and I quote, already silently predetermined in its relationship to time as presence. Focusing on the figure of the now, Derrida writes, this is a quotation, "The now is given simultaneously as that which is no longer and that which is not yet. It is what it is not, and it is not what it is." Then Derrida quotes Aristotle from the opening of his chapters on Chronos. This is Aristotle. "In one sense, the now has been and is no longer, and in another sense, it will be and is not yet." Derrida. "Thereby time is composed of non-beings. Now that which bears within it a certain nothing or no thing, that which accommodates non-beingness, cannot participate in presence, in substance, in beingness itself." Weisier. While Aristotle is constrained by thinking in terms of presence, Derrida praises Aristotle's proto-phenomenological description of telling time in the dark, unaffected by any movement, by any moving body, as a glimpse of a thinking of time that cannot simply be present. So now I want to pay close attention to a particular passage in chapter 11 of Book 4. In this passage, Aristotle speaks of the difference and the autos of Chronos. Once again, Aristotle presents Chronos in subordination to kinesis, and he makes use of the now to figure Chronos. I'll read out Edward Hussey's translation. So this is Aristotle. "Just as kinesis is always other and other, so the time is too, though the whole time in sum is itself the same. For the now is identical in being, which makes it what it is, but its being is different insofar as the now that measured time considered as before and as after." So on the one hand, the elements of Chronos, which Aristotle calls the nows, are always differing. They're always other and other. On the other hand, time considered as a whole is the same, is to auto. Otherwise, it could not be time as such. Is itself. It is itself, I should say, to auto. Where Hussey reads the phrase "Hammer pas chronos o autos" as the whole of time in sum is the same, the translators Wicksteed and Cornford read "Hamas pas chronos o autos" as a moment that embraces the whole universe. On Cornford and Wickstein's translation, Chronos exists in the moment of the now as self-identical, as being present. Now, Derrida points out that by being present, the now cannot be temporal, for temporalisation is exactly what evades presence. This is Derrida again. The now, which itself is affected, as if it were not already temporal, by a time which negates it in determining it as a past now or a future now. The now, the element of time, in this sense, is not in itself temporal. It is temporal only in becoming temporal, that is, in ceasing to be, in passing over to no thingness in the form of a being past or a being future. So the difference in being between the nows is construed in the Harvard translation, Cornford and Wicksteed's translation of Aristotle. It's construed by them in terms of a comparison between different present beings. So the now situated at different points in the movement of time, from a past now to a future now. Difference here is thought on the basis of a more primordial identity between the nows, the temporalising work of difference, the dynamic progress of difference. That which makes possible the identity of these now moments is outside of the focus of Aristotle's formulation. On Derrida's argument, Edward Hussey's translation of Hammer pas chronos o autos as the autos of the whole of time in sum does not change the status of difference, nor does it change the status of the thinking of time. for the whole of time in sum is determined as being present. Yet as Derrida notes, Aristotle acknowledges that the now and time are not identical for Aristotle. Considered as a limit, the now is not time, but is accidentally so, while considered as counting, it is a number. For the limits of those of that alone of which they are limits, but the number of these horses, the 10, is elsewhere too. Aristotle makes use of other figures for chronos, the point and the line, and the convex and the concave in terms of a circle. My point here is that Aristotle acknowledges that these figures are not able to present time in a definition. We can read Aristotle's discourse as one which admits that these figurations are ways in which time appears to us, while time itself remains fundamentally different from any of these structurations. Then it becomes a matter of finding concepts that help us to think change and to think time without dissolving it into a powder of moments in which it is untenable to conceive of the dynamic progress of time. So I want to consider another phrase which is from just immediately before what I've just been talking about, which I find suggestive for a reading of immanent time. Aristotle says that kinesis and chronos are always other and other. It's I allo kai allo. Time and motion as difference constitute radical change, but the form of their change does not change. They always differ. I allo kai allo. If difference is conceived here in terms of the difference between present moments or nows that are compared to one another, we remain in the contradictory metaphysics of presence that Derrida diagnoses so acutely. But what if the differentiation of chronos and kinesis are not thought as the measurement of a succession of nows? Bergson's postulation of duration as heterogeneous and continuous change without any affiliation to number is a rewriting of the Aristotelian claim that time and movement are always other and other. Bergsonian duration cannot be reduced to a present moment. For Bergson, the present moment does not exist when we are thinking in real time, or what he calls duration. He does affirm what he calls an idea of the living present, and he uses this to describe the mark of the actual experience of a conscious being, what excites their attention in their response to the demands of the law for attention to life. For example, a lizard sunning herself on a rock catches sight of a passing insect, snatches it with her tongue, curls her tongue back into her mouth and swallows the insect. This ensemble of successive actions occurs over a certain span of her duration. If I see her doing this, it occurs in a span of my duration too. Now I can cut out this span of lived time, and I could measure it with a stopwatch and come up with a number to represent this ensemble of actions. But this is an abstraction of the real changes that are taking place for the insect, for the lizard, and for me, all of which need to be conceived as different, though they are together. Bergson is more Aristotelian than the figuration of multiple durations, or my figuration of multiple durations here would suggest. In Duration and Simultaneity, he says we should not speak of individual durations. There is only one duration, which articulates a manifold of different durational rhythms. So, for example, the lizard's rhythm, my rhythm, the rhythm of the insect, are all implicated together in the duration of what Bergson calls the whole. The duration of the whole in Bergson can be conceived in terms of the coexistence of all rhythms of the duration of all of the beings, to speak in overly individuated terms, existing at all times. So it's a coexistence of all of the rhythms of all of the beings existing at all of the times. This duration cannot be known in an instant. For there are infinite dimensions of this becoming, coexisting together, prolonging themselves indefinitely. In this sense, for Bergson, the whole is never given, it is virtual. Now I'm going to jump to Irigaray again, and to her description of woman in Speculum of the Other Woman in the essay Volume Fluidity, which I was saying I think would, it's called Volume Without Contour in the Irigaray reader, which is a different translation of it, and I think a better one. So Irigaray's description of woman in this early text, I think, is resonant with the Bergsonian notion of the virtual whole. And this is Irigaray, and I've modified the translation a little bit. Woman is indefinite, infinite. The form is not accomplished in herself. She is not infinite, but neither is she a unity, letter, number, figure, number in a series, proper noun, unique object in a sensible world, simple ideality in an intelligible whole, entity of a foundation, etc. This incompleteness of her form, of her morphology, permits her at each instant to become something else. Now, where Irigaray figures woman's incompletion in terms of the progress of instants, I would suggest that woman, or what I propose to call the immanent maternal, should not be spoken of in terms of becoming at each instant, for there is no instantiation of becoming, only a virtual progress that takes place between moments, always other and other. Sorry, I'm looking for, here we are. Irigaray might not like what I've just suggested here, I'm not sure. In her later work, she focuses much more, I suppose, anthropocentrically on articulating a non-hierarchical relationship between woman and man, or in her even later work in response to criticism, she says of at least two sexes. So perhaps, this is in this early text, I think there's this idea of the immanent maternal that lingers from her early work. Perhaps it still lives in her ideas of nature, which she sometimes opens books by talking about it. So in Volume Without Contour, she protests against the appropriation of this immanent maternal, this woman. She protests against the appropriation of woman in the phallocentric constitution of metaphysics. For example, in the dominant formations of Aristotle's project, which present a phallocentric conceptual architecture, and the maternal does not appear as such. But perhaps we can affirm the immanent maternal and relinquish appropriation. So no more figurations of a self and a disavowed other, or phallocentric metaphysics and a disavowal of this amorphic outside, but only virtual rhythms of the immanent maternal, always other and other. That's the end of the paper. Thank you.
So thank you so much. So lots to think about. And I'm trying to make sense of the final turn of the paper towards this immanent maternal. And when you got to Bergson and this idea of there are just these durational rhythms, and as a kind of answer to saying, okay, what's the end of a duration? You know, how do you sort of parse this into the instantaneous? No, we don't. We want to persist in the notion of difference, and we get this through these rhythms that are always changing, and as it were. I wanted to understand the move to the notion of the whole still. And even it's as if we say if it's virtual, we sort of undone the kind of metaphysical recuperation we see with the notion of chronos in Aristotle. I mean, that might be one way of seeing it. And it struck me, at the very end of the paper, whether this notion of the immanent maternal is a kind of another way of thinking a whole that is not this kind of transcendent, unifying whole which has certain affiliations with maybe organismic thinking as some kind of, unity or something like that all these durational rhythms are recuperated into. I'm just trying to understand the costs of that move, to move from the many and the plurality and to try to figure out what they inhere in and whether we need the inhering in, does that make sense, and what the difference between a kind of immanent maternal might be in relationship to a kind of virtual whole. Does that make sense? Maybe I've misunderstood how you're using the immanent maternal, but if I am, I'm quite interested in why we can't just leave alone the mini rhythms. It almost feels like a kind of Haraway God trick all over again.
I don't know. So you're saying the rhythms, the multiplicity of the rhythms of duration, let's say in Bergson, as a move beyond the kind of the paralysis in the account of Chronos in the dominant reading of Aristotle's physics, which, like I was saying, I actually think there are traces in Aristotle of this effort to think. Well, I don't know. Who knows what's going on in Aristotle's mind, but I think there are traces that Bergson picks up on in a really imaginative and beautiful way to try to think duration as difference, as always other and other. I mean, I think his concept of duration as heterogeneous and continuous in a strange way is a certain kind of Aristotle. Yeah. So that's yeah, and why move from there to calling it the immanent, to Irigaray and talking about the immanent maternal?
Or even move in Bergson, there was a moment in the paper where there was a kind of, all of these rhythms are nevertheless in a whole, and that whole is virtual. So that's the move I'm trying to understand, and then understand whether the immanent maternal is another way of thinking the whole or an alternative to making that. This notion that time is always also the same.
This notion that it's always also the same. I need to think about your question because it's very difficult, and I've just written this paper and I'm still digging through it. But I've worked a lot on Bergson, and I used to really loathe his use of the whole. In fact, in some ways I still have real problems with it. I'm uncomfortable with it. Like, I prefer it when he says things like, he talks about concrete reality, which you could say is a similar kind of problem, but he talks about it as a becoming. He talks about the becoming of concrete extensity, in which there are modifications, perturbations, changes in tension and energy, and nothing else. And I like him better when he says that. The word whole just immediately has this kind of awful, problematic sense. I'm not sure I entirely understand your question, but the virtual multiplicity that he posits, which I do see as a kind of thinking of immanence, I'll try to answer it in relation to the Irigaray. I think. Yeah, go ahead.
Because it's really that, like, is the move to the whole dispensable in Bergson? Is it just a kind of rhetoric of the wholeness that becomes this kind of the organism and some kind of, recuperation of the whole at the macro level that is also in Aristotle, but that is just, you think, a sort of, in Bergson is becoming a kind of appendage that could be shed, because the notion of the multiplicity of the, these multiple, durational rhythms is itself sufficient at that point, that we don't have to recuperate in the whole. So I guess in your reading, when you say you're not interested, that you're sort of uncomfortable with the whole, do you think that we could shed that? Or is the immanent maternal a kind of answer to that?
Okay, so could we shed the notion of whole from Bergson? I think that could be a valuable manoeuvre. Yes, maybe. Like I said, I previously have preferred his formulation of it in terms of this becoming concrete extensity of modifications, perturbations, changes in tension and energy, and nothing else. And therefore, he's not claiming, because as soon as you start talking whole, it just starts sounding kind of organismic and sort of fascist, and it has a sense to it that is troubling. Maybe it can be. Maybe it's something that can be left behind of Bergson, or certainly rethought, and perhaps rethought, that needs rethinking. The manoeuvre to Irigaray, and why I'm calling it the immanent maternal, I guess it's a provocative jest. I really do think that there is a certain idea of the maternal, like there's a diagnosis of the maternal as the effaced ground of metaphysics in Irigaray, which she decries, and she sort of says that, that it can't be expressed within the closure of metaphysics, and yet her texts kind of leak out beyond that and start talking about woman in this incredibly strange way, like in the quotation I read at the end, which I think could be talked about as a kind of immanent maternal. By what right would we call it maternal when this is, I think, not human? And I think, strictly speaking, the use of maternal, I guess I would have to say, is strategic, because you can't, if you're talking about this idea of immanence, to figure it in terms of the maternal is a certain sort of, well, it's a figuration, and it can have no proper name, so I'm calling it maternal, but it could be called some other kind of thing, and those names, none of them will do justice to this idea of immanence, which has to remain, I suppose, strictly speaking, essentially nameless. Yeah. Anyway, thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, that talk was fantastic, and I'm just trying to wrap my mind around it, but I did, and I don't know if this is too grand a question, you did mention that Irigaray herself might, take issue with your preference of this thinking of temporality in her early work. And I know she is, in some sense, really prone to grand epochal kind of characterizations, both of human history and of her own work. Yes. She'll say we've gone from the age of the father to the age of the son to the dawning age of the couple, or she'll describe her early work as the critique of phallogocentrism, her middle work as an alternative symbolic for the feminine, and then her later work as relationality, or in terms of the potential for different sorts of relationality along the lines of sexual difference. But is there any sense in which a notion of the immanent maternal, do you think, in what sense does it relate to other notions of epochal shift, or can it be made to relate to such, or is it totally in contradiction?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'd have to think more about the concept of the epochal shift to make that kind of, to answer you, and I haven't. I think it probably isn't related, but I'm not. Yeah, okay. It's not a frame that I've been thinking about the idea of immanence with in terms of a kind of epoch. Maybe because I think of epochs too much in terms of. And this might be a poor conception of, there might be better conceptions of epochs, but I tend to think of epochs in terms of, actually, I could really spend a long time thinking about that. But I tend to think of it in terms of linear time. Or time, I tend to think of it in terms of time, time in terms of succession. Whereas the immanent time that I'm trying to think about would be a time of, I guess it's a time of coexistence. It's coexistence, but so I think that the concept of the epoch doesn't kind of mesh that well for me in my attempt at improvising an answer to your question. Yeah.